History has a strange way of watering down controversy. Today, it's almost impossible to imagine America without rock and roll. Jackie Robinson is celebrated every April across Major League Baseball. Mary Tyler Moore is remembered as one of the most influential women in television history. We are really good at celebrating those victories. But do we give enough attention to the other part of the story, the uncomfortable in between moment of uncertainty? It's easy to forget that each of them once made people feel genuinely uncomfortable, the kind of uncomfortable that filled newspaper editorials, church sermons, dinner table conversations, and television boardrooms. People worried about Elvis, people feared Jackie Robinson, and people argued over Mary Tyler Moore. And in every case, the debate sounded bigger than the person at the center of it. Because it was. These weren't really arguments about music, baseball, or television. They were arguments about what America was becoming. I set out to understand why these three people had such an outsized influence on American culture. What I found was something much bigger than any one of them. They represented three moments when an entire country was negotiating a new definition of what felt normal. The remarkable part is that all three negotiations worked in almost exactly the same way. So let's rewind and let's get into it. When Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in September of 1956, he walked into American living rooms during an hour that still belonged to the entire family. Television had yet to splinter into the private, individualized experience we know today. Most homes had one television set, if they were lucky, and it sat in the shared room, where everyone gathered around the same screen and watched whatever the family had agreed to watch, or whatever the adults had decided they were watching. On Sunday nights, that often meant Ed Sullivan, whose variety show offered something for almost everyone. There were comedians and acrobats and opera singers, trained animals, Broadway performers, and respectable celebrities introduced by a host whose stiff posture and famously awkward delivery made him seem less like a dangerous Hollywood tastemaker and more like the slightly uncomfortable uncle presiding over the evening. An appearance on Sullivan's stage carried a kind of approval. It meant that whatever was happening in nightclubs, or concert halls, or distant corners of American culture had been inspected and deemed safe enough to enter the home. And by the fall of 1956, the home was where the argument over Elvis Presley was heading. The argument had already been building for months. Following him from city to city, his audiences became harder to control, and newspaper reporters attempted to explain why otherwise ordinary teenage girls seemed to lose their minds in his presence. A Time magazine article published that May described Presley's body taking on a frantic quiver while girls screamed around him. The reporter wrote about worried parents, puzzled psychologists, and letters to the editor pages filling with adult alarm and teenage adoration. Elvis was 21 years old. Although photographs from that year sometimes make him look even younger, his face was soft and almost delicate, childlike, framed by dark hair that he combed into a carefully sculpted wave. He could appear shy when he spoke, occasionally lowering his eyes or fumbling for an answer. Then the music began, and the young man that reporters met backstage seemed to disappear. On stage, he moved as though the rhythm traveled through his entire body before it reached his voice. His legs shook, his hips rolled. He leaned into the microphone, curled his lip, and stretched familiar songs into something that sounded less polished and more physical than much of the popular music white audiences were accustomed to hearing. Elvis insisted that none of this was calculated. He said, quote, "I get in rhythm with the music and I jump around to it because I enjoy what I'm doing," end quote. He told reporters during a tour through Florida, he said he wasn't trying to appear vulgar or sell sex. He was trying to perform the music as he felt it. The problem was that millions of young Americans appeared to feel it too. And this was happening at a peculiar moment in American history because the country had recently discovered that these young people represented something more than a transitional stage between childhood and adulthood. They represented a market. The word teenager had existed before Elvis, and young people had certainly developed their own fashions and slang and musical tastes before the 1950s. Frank Sinatra had been surrounded by screaming bobby soxers in the 1940s, and earlier generations had created youth cultures around jazz and swing and movies and dance halls. So Elvis didn't invent the teenage fan any more than the 1950s literally invented adolescence. But what changed after World War II was the scale of it. A growing number of American adolescents were staying in school rather than moving directly into full time work. Post war prosperity gave many families more disposable income, which meant some of that money made its way into the hands of their children. Teenagers could earn money through part time jobs and actually spend it on themselves. They bought clothes and magazines and movie tickets and cars and records. Businesses began studying their habits and created advertisements for them, speaking about them as a distinct category of consumer. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History describes the 1950s as the moment advertisers began treating teens as a unique, age defined market. 17 magazine even created a fictional composite consumer named Tina, built from research about teenage girls, and presented it to manufacturers and retailers, hoping to sell to them. There's something almost funny about that image. Adults in offices studying charts and surveys, and they're trying to decode a generation that parents at home were also struggling to understand. Because once businesses realized teenagers had money, an enormous cultural machine began competing for their attention. The music industry had the perfect product. A child could now hear voices that a parent couldn't hear. They could develop tastes that parents didn't share. They could join a national culture of young people who dressed alike and listened to the same songs, copied the same hairstyles, and understood references that made little sense to the adults raising them. The private bedroom was becoming a cultural border. A closed door could now contain a record player and a radio, a stack of magazines, and an entire world. And somewhere inside that world, a white teenager might tune a radio dial late at night and hear black rhythm and blues coming from a station their parents rarely listened to. That part of Elvis's story cannot be separated from everything that followed. Rock and roll grew from black musical traditions that had been evolving for generations. Blues, gospel, rhythm and blues, and other forms that white performers and producers and audiences often consumed without extending equal recognition or opportunity to the black musicians who created them. The music business remained segregated, even while the sounds themselves crossed racial lines. Elvis grew up in Mississippi and Memphis, surrounded by gospel and country and black music. As a child, he attended an Assembly of God church with his family where gospel music became one of his earliest influences. Later in Memphis, he listened to black artists and absorbed styles of singing and movement that didn't fit neatly within the racial categories maintained by the commercial music industry. When Sam Phillips of Sun Records recorded Elvis in 1954, he captured a performer whose sound was difficult to classify. Elvis was white, but many listeners hearing him for the first time actually assumed otherwise. He sang country music with the energy of rhythm and blues and performed black songs for white audiences, helping bring sounds that had often been confined to black radio stations and record charts into the center of white popular culture. That crossover helped make him famous. It also made him frightening. And let me say, the anxiety surrounding Elvis cannot be reduced to parents disliking a young man's hips. His performances brought several boundaries into the same room at once. The music crossed racial lines, and his movements challenged expectations of how respectable white men were supposed to carry themselves. His appearance played with masculinity in ways that confused some observers. Carefully styled hair, flashy clothing, and a face that could look almost feminine until he began moving with a startling physical confidence. And his fans responded with an openness that violated the era's expectations of how respectable young men should behave in public. The girls screamed because they wanted to scream. They cried and reached for him and pushed toward the stage and expressed a kind of desire that adults were accustomed to regulating more carefully. They went into a trance. The spectacle disturbed people because the teenagers in the audience seemed temporarily beyond adult control, and each time someone tried to restore that control, Elvis's popularity grew. On June 5th, 1956, Elvis appeared on The Milton Berle Show and performed Hound Dog. During an instrumental break, he slowed the song down and exaggerated his movements, drawing screams from the audience and outrage from critics afterward. The performance followed him into newspaper columns and public discussions about obscenity, juvenile delinquency, and the moral condition of American youth. Less than a month later, NBC presented a more acceptable version of him. Steve Allen dressed Elvis in a tuxedo and had him sing Hound Dog to an actual basset hound wearing a top hat. Elvis stood stiffly beside the animal, his movements contained, and the joke aimed largely at himself. Here was the dangerous rock and roll singer transformed into a novelty act that adults could laugh at. Elvis complied, but photographs from the appearance show a performer who understood the joke perfectly well. The attempt to tame him did little to slow his ascent. Hound Dog became a massive hit. Audiences continued to pack his concerts. Girls continued to scream. And the public humiliation intended to reduce him only gave his fans another reason to see him as their own. The message was becoming clear. Adults could mock Elvis and condemn him and dress him in whatever they wanted, but they could no longer decide whether he mattered. That decision had already been made elsewhere, and that was in the bedrooms and the school hallways and the record stores and telephone conversations between young people. By August, Elvis was touring Florida, performing as many as 3 shows a day. In Jacksonville, his arrival created enough concern that juvenile court judge Marion Gooding prepared warrants charging him with impairing the morals of minors. The judge summoned Elvis to his office and warned that he could be arrested if his movements on stage became too suggestive. Police officers were stationed near the stage, and Gooding attended the performances himself to watch for violations. Elvis responded by turning the confrontation into part of the show. Unable, or at least unwilling, to move the way his audience expected, he stood mostly still and wiggled one finger. The girls screamed anyway. In some accounts, the single finger drove them even wilder because everyone in the theater understood what it represented. The authorities had succeeded in limiting the motion of Elvis Presley's body, yet they couldn't do anything about what thousands of teenagers saw when he moved the finger. Gooding reportedly found the modified act acceptable. After observing the show, he allowed his own daughters to attend. The boundary moved in the span of an evening. Elvis had not become a different person. The judge's perception of the danger had just changed. Yet the controversy surrounding Elvis Presley continued to make Ed Sullivan uneasy. Sullivan had built his reputation by understanding the broad American audience. His program offered novelty without chaos, sophistication without alienation, and excitement that remained safely contained within the boundaries of a family entertainment. He had previously declined to book Elvis, doubting whether the singer belonged on stage, but Elvis's appearances on competing programs drew enormous ratings, and the commercial reality became almost impossible to ignore. Sullivan eventually agreed to pay Elvis Presley $50,000 for 3 appearances. That was a wild amount of money at that time. For context, the equivalent of more than $600,000 today for just 3 appearances. The negotiation itself tells us something about the changing balance of power. The gatekeeper had not chosen the star. The audience had chosen him, and the gatekeeper was catching up. On September 9th, 1956, an estimated 60 million Americans watched TV that night. Today, we think of the Super Bowl as the closest thing to a shared national television event, right? But Elvis's first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show was even more dominant than that. More than 80% of everyone watching television that evening was watching Elvis. For context, the Super Bowl can average between 120 to 130 million, which is only a third of the U.S. population. As for that night, Ed Sullivan was recovering from injuries sustained in a car accident, so actor Charles Lawton hosted from New York while the broadcast cut to CBS Television City in Los Angeles, where Elvis was working on his first movie. Lawton introduced him, and the picture shifted across the country. Elvis stood on stage in a plaid jacket and his guitar hanging in front of him. He began with "Don't Be Cruel," and what I like to call the Elvis trance accompanying screaming started almost immediately. And I have to say, just as an aside, I watched this whole performance. I watched the whole show, the whole hour-long Ed Sullivan Show, and it was really, really entertaining to watch and just understand, like, how history was unfolding in those moments, and you can actually feel the guttural reactions from these girls in their screaming when he comes on stage. I would highly recommend going to YouTube and just watching it. It's really an interesting thing. So, as the television cameras move between Elvis and the audience, capturing young women smiling and shouting and staring at him with an intensity that required no interpretation. So, when he performed Love Me Tender, a song that had not been released yet, the camera moved a lot closer to his face. For the faster songs, it widened enough for viewers to understand what all the arguments had been about. So it was showing all of his dance moves and the band. But during this particular song, it really got up close and personal. And inside millions of homes, families were watching this together. So now, at this point, Elvis had become too large to keep outside the gates. Yet gaining access didn't immediately make him safe. The following morning, Americans continued the argument in newspaper columns and churches and public spaces. Some critics saw vulgarity and some saw juvenile delinquency. Some heard black music reaching white children and understood that boundaries surrounding race were becoming more difficult to enforce. Others saw an entertainer being blamed for desires and frustrations that already existed within the generation watching him. Elvis had become the visible center of a transformation that had been gathering for years, quite frankly. The teenager had acquired money and privacy and mobility and a national culture. Now the teenager had a star. And perhaps the most unsettling part for the adults watching this was the realization that Elvis didn't require their admiration. Young people had given him something that earlier entertainers generally needed adult institutions to provide, which was legitimacy. And once millions of young people had learned that they could choose their own heroes, there was no realistic way to make them forget it. Looking back at it, Elvis seems inevitable because we've spent the better part of 70 years living in the world he helped create. Rock and roll won. Teenagers became one of the most influential consumer groups in the world. Every generation since has had its own stars that adults don't quite understand. It's easy to forget there was a moment when none of that seemed certain. It's interesting to think about America as having this habit of choosing ordinary people to stand in for extraordinary change. They become symbols for arguments that are far bigger than themselves. Before long, people stop debating the individual and start debating everything the individual seems to represent. 9 years before Elvis walked on to the Ed Sullivan Show, another young man found himself carrying that kind of burden, too. He wasn't trying to redefine music, he was trying to play baseball. And yet, by the time he stepped onto Ebbets Field in Brooklyn on April 15, 1947, millions of Americans had already decided what a success or failure would mean. His name was Jackie Robinson. On the afternoon of April 15, 1947, more than 26,000 people filed into Ebbets Field in Brooklyn to watch the Dodgers open their season against the Boston Braves. At first glance, it looked like any other opening day. Vendors shouted from the aisles, children leaned over the railings hoping to catch a glimpse of their favorite players, reporters filled the press box, sharpening pencils and comparing notes before the first pitch. The smell of cigars drifted through the grandstand, and fans settled into their seats. But everyone in the stadium understood this wasn't just another baseball game. For the first time in the 20th century, a black man was taking the field in Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson was 28 years old. He had served as an Army officer during World War II. He had starred at UCLA in 4 different sports. He had spent the previous season with the Montreal Royals, proving to Brooklyn Dodgers executive Branch Rickey that he possessed not only extraordinary athletic ability, but something far more difficult to measure: the ability to not fight back. Rickey had made that clear from the beginning. The challenge wasn't whether Robinson could hit a fastball. The challenge was whether he could endure the abuse that he knew was coming. During one of their earliest meetings, Rickey acted out the insults Robinson would almost certainly hear from opposing players and fans, and maybe even teammates. He cursed at him. He questioned his character. He imagined punches being thrown. Then he asked Robinson a question that has become one of the defining moments in American sports. Do you have the guts to not fight back? It sounds backwards almost. Most of us think of courage as the willingness to throw the punch, right? Rickey was asking for something much harder, just to absorb it. And the punches came almost immediately. Opposing players taunted him from the dugout, and fans shouted racial slurs from the stands. Hotels refused to accommodate him, and restaurants turned him away. There were even death threats arriving through the mail. On the road, there were cities where his teammates slept comfortably while Robinson searched for somewhere, anywhere that would allow him through the front door. It's difficult to overstate the pressure he carried. Every strikeout became evidence to his critics that black players didn't belong in major leagues, and every mistake threatened to confirm prejudices that had existed long before Robinson ever put on a Dodgers uniform. And every success challenged them. Like Elvis, Robinson found himself carrying expectations that no single person could possibly satisfy. He wasn't simply expected to play baseball. He was expected to represent millions of Americans who had never been given the opportunity to stand where he was standing. There's an important difference between the two stories, though. Adults worried that Elvis might change their children. Many Americans feared Jackie Robinson might change the entire country. And you could argue that made the resistance deeper and far more dangerous in some people's eyes. Looking back, it can be tempting to imagine that everyone understood what Jackie Robinson represented, but they didn't. Many Americans didn't see themselves as participating in one of those defining civil rights stories of the 20th century. They thought they were arguing about baseball. Sports writers debated whether the game was changing too quickly. Team owners questioned whether fans would stop buying tickets. Opposing players complained that integration threatened tradition that had existed for decades. Letters poured into newspapers, and some celebrated the decision, and others insisted that baseball had crossed a line it could never uncross. The arguments sounded remarkably familiar. Some insisted that Robinson had earned his opportunity and deserved to be judged like any other player. Others argued that baseball was being forced to change for political reasons instead of competitive ones. Very few people framed the debate as historians would later remember it. They believed they were defending or reshaping the game that they loved. It called itself the national pastime. If America wanted to understand itself, it often looked to baseball first. Children learned its rules before they learned algebra. Presidents threw out opening day first pitches. Newspapers devoted entire sections to box scores and batting averages. Summer afternoons unfolded according to the rhythm of innings, not hours. If segregation could end there, on the most visible stage in American sports, people naturally wondered where the change would stop. That was the source of anxiety. Jackie Robinson wasn't merely crossing a foul line. To millions of Americans, he was crossing a social one. And just as Elvis would later become a symbol for changing ideas about youth and music and culture, Robinson became a symbol for changing ideas about race and citizenship and who had the right to fully participate in American life. Neither man asked for that role. History assigned it to them. In both cases, the individual mattered, but the reaction said even more about the country watching. Today, Jackie Robinson is almost universally admired. Every April 15th, every major league player wears the number 42. Politicians from both parties invoke his legacy. Schools bear his name, and statues stand outside stadiums across the country. But admiration has a way of flattening history. It allows us to forget that there was a time when honoring Jackie Robinson was a controversial act in itself, that there was an uncomfortable middle period where we all disagreed. And just as America eventually stopped arguing over whether Robinson belonged on a baseball field, another debate was already beginning over whether a woman belonged somewhere she had rarely been allowed before, not in a supporting role or just as someone's wife, but at the center of the story. Her name was Mary Tyler Moore. On the evening of October 3rd, 1961, millions of Americans tuned into the second season of The Dick Van Dyke Show. There wasn't anything particularly controversial about the episode itself. It was a lighthearted sitcom about a suburban family life. There was a husband and a wife and a young son, and the everyday mishaps that filled a half-hour comedy. If anything, it represented the America television executives were most comfortable showing: warm and stable and respectable. But there was one small detail that almost never made it onto the screen. Laura Petrie, which was Mary Tyler Moore's character, was wearing capri pants. Today, it sounds almost absurd that a pair of pants could become the subject of network debate. Yet, in the early 1960s, television wives were expected to look a certain way. They cooked in dresses and cleaned in dresses, and they welcomed their husbands home in dresses. Even in the privacy of their own homes, they reflected an ideal of femininity that television believed Americans wanted to see. Carl Reiner thought it was ridiculous. The decision did not begin as a declaration about women's liberation, though. Mary Tyler Moore simply wanted Laura Petrie to resemble the women she knew. Television wives, she later recalled, were forever vacuuming in flowered dresses and high heels. She did not dress that way, and neither did her friends. "Why don't we try to make this real?" she remembered asking. She wanted to dress on the show as she dressed at home. The sponsors were less concerned with realism than with the precise fit of the trousers. Their objection, Moore said, was that the capris showed too much definition around her backside, a problem they described with a peculiar phrase, cupping under. The initial compromise allowed her to wear pants in only one scene per episode, after the costume had been inspected to ensure that there was as little cupping under as possible. Moore and the production team soon began quietly ignoring the restriction. Within weeks, she recalled, they were slipping the pants into several scenes, fitted exactly as the sponsors had feared. But nothing disastrous happened. Audiences continued watching. Women continued identifying with Laura, and a wardrobe choice that had required negotiation gradually became one of the character's defining features. But at the end of the day, no one was really debating pants. They were debating whether television should begin reflecting a version of American womanhood that already existed outside the studio walls. Millions of women had been wearing slacks at home for years. Television was simply catching up. The debate over Laura Petrie's wardrobe ended much the way these debates often do. People got used to it. Week after week, millions of Americans welcomed the Petrie family into their homes. They laughed at the jokes and they watched Richie grow up. And after a while, Laura's capri pants stopped looking unusual. They simply became part of the character. It was a pattern America had already seen before. What feels threatening at first has a remarkable way of becoming invisible. For Mary Tyler Moore, Laura Petrie was only the beginning, though. By the end of the 1960s, the country looked very different from the one she had entered just a decade earlier. The civil rights movement had transformed American law. The birth control pill had given millions of women greater control over their own futures. More women were graduating from college, entering the workforce, and delaying marriage than at any point in modern American history. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had become a bestseller. The National Organization for Women had also been founded. Conversations about equality were no longer confined to universities and activist circles. They were finding their way into kitchens and offices and living rooms across the country. To put it into greater context, during the Dick Van Dyke Show, about 24% of women worked outside the home. By 1970, it was up to about 50%. And the statistics are similar for female graduates. Television, however, was still lagging behind and reflecting that. The women that audiences saw each week rarely resembled the women they were increasingly becoming. When producers James L. Brooks and Alan Burns began developing a new sitcom for Mary Tyler Moore, they originally imagined her as a divorcee. The idea didn't survive very long. When Brooks and Burns presented the premise to CBS, the response was immediate. According to Burns, a network executive stared at the idea and asked, "You want to divorce Mary?" The objection was partly practical. Viewers might assume that Mary Tyler Moore had divorced Rob Petrie, the fictional husband audiences had spent 5 seasons watching her adore. Yet the network's anxiety went well beyond confusion between actress and character. Burns remembered being told that American audiences would not tolerate four things on television: people from New York, divorce, Jews, and mustaches. The list was delivered as industry wisdom, the accumulated certainty of executives who believed they knew precisely where the boundaries of American comfort lay. Television had spent years asking audiences to see Moore as America's ideal wife. Asking them to imagine that wife divorced did not merely alter a sitcom premise, it threatened to turn one of television's most reassuring symbols of marriage into evidence that a woman could leave one life and construct another. So the writers changed the premise. Mary Richards wouldn't be divorced, she would simply be single. I think it's difficult to appreciate how radical that sounded in 1970 without remembering what audiences expected from television. Single women certainly appeared on sitcoms, but they were usually moving toward something like marriage or a romance or becoming a wife. Mary Richards wasn't waiting for her life to begin, she was already living it. She rented her own apartment and paid her own bills, and she worked in a newsroom filled almost entirely with men. Her life wasn't presented as incomplete, though, it was presented as completely normal. And I think that may have been the show's most revolutionary decision. It never argued that every woman should live like Mary Richards, it just treated the possibility as entirely unremarkable. That quiet confidence was precisely what made the show so influential. So, for millions of women, Mary Richards wasn't someone to admire from a distance, she was someone they recognized. The show's creators understood that they weren't making a political statement either. They were making a comedy about people they saw all around them. James L. Brooks would later say they wanted to portray the lives of young professional women they knew in Minneapolis and Los Angeles, not as symbols, but as actual people. But not everyone saw it that way. Some critics argued that the show glamorized a lifestyle that would encourage women to delay marriage or prioritize careers over family. Others believed television was drifting further away from traditional values by presenting independence as something desirable rather than temporary. The criticisms rarely reached the fever pitch that surrounded Elvis Presley, but they reflected the same underlying fear. If television made this life seem normal, would more women choose it? That question lingered beneath many of the conversations surrounding the show. It really wasn't about Mary Richards at this point, it was about the future. By the middle of the 1970s, that future was arriving faster than any Americans had expected. Women's participation in the workforce continued to climb. Colleges graduated record numbers of women. More women delayed marriage. More lived on their own before marrying. More expected careers that extended beyond the years before children. Television hadn't created those changes, it had just reflected them. and in reflecting them, it helped make them feel familiar. That may be one of media's most understated forms of influence. It rarely changes a culture overnight, but it makes yesterday's exception feel like today's normal. By the time The Mary Tyler Moore Show aired its final episode in March of '77, that normalization was complete. The newsroom was closing, everyone was losing their jobs, and one by one, the staff embraced in a long group hug that has since become one of the most beloved finales in television history. They shuffled together toward the newsroom, arms wrapped around one another, before realizing that they had forgotten one small detail. No one turned off the lights. Lou Grant walked back into the room, flipped the switch, and quietly closed the door. It was the perfect ending. When Mary Tyler Moore first appeared on television, network executives worried that audiences might reject a housewife in capri pants. 16 years later, millions of Americans were saying goodbye to a woman whose career, not her marriage, had defined one of television's greatest comedies. The country had changed. So had the stories it wanted to tell. So we have Elvis Presley, Jackie Robinson, and Mary Tyler Moore, three popping up in totally different industries with completely different personalities. Elvis was impulsive and magnetic. Jackie Robinson was disciplined almost beyond comprehension. Mary Tyler Moore possessed a warmth that made change feel approachable instead of confrontational. And at first, I found myself looking for the personality trait they all shared. Maybe it was the courage to be different, or the willingness to stand alone, the confidence to ignore critics. Those qualities definitely mattered, but they don't fully explain what happened. After all, history is full of talented musicians who never changed American culture, and it's full of remarkable athletes whose names have been largely forgotten. It's full of gifted actresses who never became symbols of an era. So, why these three? The more I read, the more I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. The better question isn't what made them extraordinary, it's what made this moment extraordinary. None of them invented the changes they're remembered for. Teenagers existed before Elvis Presley. Black baseball players had spent decades proving they belonged in the major leagues before Jackie Robinson ever put on a Dodgers uniform. Independent women were building careers, delaying marriage, and redefining adulthood long before Mary Richards walked into the WJM newsroom. The change was already happening. They simply made it visible. One historian described people like this as a boundary figure, individuals who appear at the precise moment a society is already beginning to renegotiate one of its own rules. They don't create the tension, they become the place where everyone else experiences it. That helps explain something all three stories had in common. The reaction was never proportional to what they actually did. I mean, Elvis sang 4 songs on television. Jackie Robinson played baseball. Mary Tyler Moore wore capri pants, then later portrayed a woman who happened to like her job. None of those acts by themselves threatened the foundations of American society. What they threatened was something much less tangible: a script and an expectation, an assumption about how the world was supposed to work. And once those assumptions had a face attached to them, the argument stopped being abstract. It became personal. That, according to research, is often how cultural change unfolds. The initial act is amplified until it feels much larger than it really is, not because the act itself has changed, but because some people begin treating it as a symbol of the future they either hope or fear. But amplification alone isn't enough. History is full of people who shocked culture and then disappeared. What made Elvis, Jackie, and Mary different is that Americans didn't encounter them at once. They encountered them again, and again, and again, and again. Every new television appearance, every baseball game, every Saturday night sitcom. The unfamiliar slowly became very familiar. Psychologists call this the mere exposure effect. Repeated exposure changes how we feel about what once seemed strange. Historians describe a similar process. New ideas stop feeling like disruptions and gradually become ordinary until one day they're no longer debated at all. Of course, none of that would have happened without institutions. Branch Rickey had to keep Jackie Robinson on the field. Ed Sullivan eventually decided Elvis belonged on television. And CBS executives, despite their hesitation, ultimately allowed millions of Americans to spend 7 seasons with Mary Richards. The gatekeepers resisted, and then they eventually adapted. And once institutions stopped trying to exclude the new idea, they began distributing it instead. That may be the most surprising part of the entire story. The people who first treated these figures as threats often became the same institutions that later celebrated them. Graceland became a national historic landmark. Every Major League Baseball player now wears Jackie Robinson's number each April. Mary Tyler Moore is remembered as the woman who helped redefine what a television heroine could be. History has a curious habit of laundering controversy into heritage. The conflict isn't erased, exactly. It's just softened. The sharp edges disappear. The arguments fade, and what remains is the comforting story that progress always seemed inevitable. It almost never did, though. Thanks for listening to This Again. I'm your host, Mallory Faust, and I'll see you next time.